Hello, all you people out there. Today, I want to talk about surveillance. So first, I'm going to talk about surveillance as a theme in the Black Mirror episode Nosedive. Then I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the ideas in Zuboff's The Age of Surveillance Capitalism. Okay, so one way of setting up the discussion is that Nosedive focuses not exclusively, but more on the kind of a set of possible sort of psychological or personal or interpersonal dangers that come from a certain role that social media might come to play in our lives. And Zuboff is focused on the economic and political dimensions of businesses that work by accumulating very large amounts of information about us and selling predictions about our behavior. So starting with Nosedive and moving to Zuboff. Okay, but before we go into Nosedive, most of this discussion is going to be very critical, but I think it's good and important to start out by saying a little bit about how we've benefited from social media. Okay, so it's obvious that we've benefited from the internet in all sorts of ways. You know, email is cheap. Google search gives people access to all sorts of information that would have taken ages to acquire in the past. Social media allow us to keep in touch with people, to form new relationships with people all around the world, and there are sort of distinctive forms of, culture and social life that arise on social media, which are a lot of fun. Memes are fun, TikTok dances can be fun, whatever. Okay, so there are all sorts of benefits of social media, and I think it's worth bearing that in mind because I think we probably have a sort of bit of a negative script for talking about social media, and we want to be mindful that we're not just sort of running on autopilot or just sort of parroting the ideas that are in the air without being, frank and reasonable with ourselves about what we get out of these things. Okay, so that's one big caveat. Now let's get into Nosedive. Okay, so Nosedive depicts this world which is dominated by this type of ranking system where people can rate one another in all sorts of interactions, online and in person, on a scale from 1 to 5. And this ranking system branches out in its social consequences in a lot of sort of disturbing ways. Sorry, it's very windy out. Hopefully you can hear me all right. Okay. So, the main thing that you notice at first is that people sort of get along in this kind of blandly polite, uniform way where they just sort of try to be sort of inoffensively nice and pleasant to each other, and to only sort of show sort of parts of themselves or parts of their lives or parts of their thoughts or feelings that are going to sort of get sort of quick, easy approval from others. Okay, so there's a suggestion in the story that there's something missing from this, that there's something missing from this type of life. Okay, there's also a sort of more economic or financial dimension to this, where it's clear that people's employment and their access to housing and their access to various sorts of opportunities in life are determined by their ranking in this rating system. Okay, so this rating system has sort of been weaponized against people, and you get the sense that forms of inequality that we have in daily life here in the United States get somehow more deeply entrenched or exacerbated or something like that by the sort of widespread use of this rating system. That this rating system sort of keeps people stuck in social strata in social statuses and socioeconomic statuses, whatever, that they might otherwise have some freedom to, move out of. Okay. There's, somebody might say, well, we only disclose certain parts of ourselves in every sort of domain of our lives. I act a certain way with my parents, a certain way with my students, a certain way with my friends, a certain way with, the cashier at the grocery store, whatever. So how is this any different? You might also say, we go around ranking people all the time. We make judgments about people all the time. That person's cool, that person's a schmuck, whatever. Okay. I think the sense is that, the sense in the story is that this, these sort of normal and perfectly fine and healthy aspects of our lives sort of take a kind of dangerous or pathological turn when these rankings become sort of flattened into a single ranking, which is sort of globally broadcast to everybody in the world. Everybody who wants information about how you've been ranked can get it. And there's the sense that it's not just that you're showing one part of yourself here and another part of yourself here and another part of yourself here. It's that as this ranking system sort of permeates all aspects of our lives, we are forced to hide the more interesting or critical or whatever parts of ourselves it sort of across the board. Okay. I'll say the one way of thinking about this that might be helpful from philosophy comes from the philosopher T. Nguyen, who's written a bit about gamification. And Nguyen's concern is that, what games do is they give you a very specific sort of goal that you want to achieve. There's a way that you win the game, however you tally up the points, whatever counts as winning. And, while you're playing a game, you are invested in reaching that goal. And the problem comes when we sort of gamify aspects of our lives where the right goals are goals that would actually conduce to our own well-being or the well-being of the people around us don't match the goals of the game. So this is maybe already obvious in the case of the social media that we have today, where, what our goals might be sort of naturally or spontaneously in a conversation with another person don't match the goals of, kind of the game of Facebook or Twitter or Instagram or whatever, where, the built into the platform is, the aim of getting more favorites, getting more comments, getting more retweets, getting more shares, whatever. Okay. So one way of thinking about the somewhat abstractly, but I think helpfully, thinking about the dangers that are involved here are in thinking in terms of gamification and how gamification can narrow the rich, complex, messy goals that we have in some domain of our lives into a smaller but less healthy, less productive, less conducive to human well-being set of goals that are sort of constitutive of the game. Okay. At this point, I think a question that we should ask is there any way out of this? Okay, we don't live in the world of Nosedive yet, but maybe you think we're headed in that direction, or at the very least you might want to prevent us from heading further in that direction. And you could ask, well, how do we do this? One way of asking that question is sort of asking personally, well, how do I change my own relationship to social media, or how do I change my own relationship to the internet or to websites that invite me to rank things, Yelp or whatever. And I think that's a fair question. But we can also ask at a sort of different level of abstraction, how could social media businesses be organized differently to prevent the kind of nightmare scenario of Nosedive from coming to pass? And this is the transition to Zuboff. Okay, so Zuboff says, the real enemy here, the real heart of the problem is what she calls surveillance capitalism. And surveillance capitalism is something like a type of market or an economic logic or way of organizing businesses or our trade relationships that revolves around businesses sort of unaccountably accumulating huge quantities of information about us and turning that information into predictions about our future behavior that they can sell. And where often these predictions are sort of made in part on the basis of interventions that those businesses take in our behaviors. So they make predictions about our behavior which are sort of grounded in things that they make us do. Okay. It's worth noting that I think probably when we usually think about surveillance, I think probably the sort of stereotype that a lot of people have in mind of surveillance is government surveillance. And, the cops spying on Muslim student organizations at Brooklyn College, or infiltrating activist movements like BLM or the labor movement or the Communist Party, or in an example I sent you in an email, neighbors who are encouraged to spy on one another for sort of possible signs of politically subversive nationalist tendencies or independence-leaning tendencies in Puerto Rico in the middle of the 20th century. Okay, so we're very familiar with, I think, relatively familiar with, I'll say, the shapes that government surveillance can take. But surveillance capitalism is, at least to some extent, and maybe to a very deep extent, a different sort of beast, because the role that profit and buying and selling information about people, rather than just sort of collecting it for political purposes, is different in surveillance capitalism than it is in the various examples of government surveillance that I gave a minute ago. Okay. One of the points that Zuboff makes, and that she really tries to drive home in her history of Google, and also her discussion of the difference between the Aware Home and the Nest thermostat, sort of different models for sort of web-enabled services that that businesses could provide within our own homes. One of the points that Zuboff is sort of at great pains to reiterate again and again is that things don't have to be this way. So you might think that, well, Google accumulating information about, our consumer behavior and where we go on the internet. Facebook keeps, buying and selling predictions about, our behavior and to advertisers and so on. You might think, well, this is just how the internet has to work. But Zuboff tells this history which shows that, well, actually the development of these sorts of business models is a result of a sort of bunch of kind of very contingent, very historically specific things that happened in the late 90s, early 2000s. The burst of the dot-com bubble around 1999-2000, and the financial anxiety that tech businesses like Google had around the time. The government's increased reliance on tech companies for surveillance after 9/11, and so on and so forth. All of these things are sort of historical accidents in some sense. They didn't have to happen. Okay. Two last questions that I want to address. One question about, what is there's a sort of ominous description of this type of market, but it's not always 100% clear what's actually supposed to be wrong with it. Like, well, what's the argument against this sort of thing? After all, like I said before, we clearly get things out of Google. We get things out of social media. It would have been impossible, more or less, for me to set up this class if I didn't have Google search, for that matter, if I didn't have YouTube, which is a Google property. Okay. So what's the sort of moral basis for the critique here? I think partly it's a critique about there's a sort of general skepticism of very large asymmetries of power and knowledge. So Google has great power and Facebook have great power over you, and you have no power over it, at least arguably. Google knows a lot about you, and you know nothing about or you know very little about the information it collects and the predictions about its future behavior that it buys and sells to other companies. There's a maybe a concern about sort of democracy and sort of public control for, so you know, as disability rights activists sometimes say, nothing about us without us. You know, so if Google is making really significant decisions about you, you know, you should have some control over those decisions. So you know, maybe the concern is a concern about sort of what sorts of decisions should be made privately and what decisions should be made democratically. For her part, Zuboff sort of introduces two rights which might be relevant in thinking about this. She talks about the right to the future tense and the right to sanctuary. And the right to the future tense is basically like, well, you know, if there's going to be some very dramatic change in the organization of society in the future, you have a right to have some say in it. She talks about the history of the development of the right to be forgotten in European courts, the right to request that Google take down unflattering or dangerous or embarrassing or whatever search results about you, if you want those search results to be taken down. So you know, she thinks this sort of historical trajectory is one that shows people sort of willingness to fight for their right to the future tense, their willingness to fight for the right to have some decision-making power over the future of their own lives, but also the future of you know, society in general. Okay, and the right to sanctuary sounds a lot like the right to privacy, so the right to keep certain, which we often understand in informational terms, the right to, okay, the bachata guy who passes by my apartment just joined us for a second. Okay, so you know, we're familiar enough with the right to privacy, which we understand often in informational terms. So you know, keeping certain facts about yourself, you know, to yourself or to your family or whatever. You know, not having embarrassing medical conditions be publicized and that kind of thing. Okay. But the right to sanctuary might go a little bit further. It's not just that you have a right to keep certain information about yourself private. There we go. It's not that you have a right to keep certain information about yourself private, but that you have a right not to have businesses sort of interfering with your life in any way in some sort of sphere. So, you know, when you're at home or something, you know, you want to be free from the interference of Google or Facebook or whatever. Okay. Lastly, we can ask, what do you do to solve this problem? Okay, so if Zuboff, and this is a big if, but if Zuboff has, you know, correctly named the beast, has correctly identified the sort of ultimate source of the, you know, anxieties that a lot of people have about businesses like Google and Facebook that buy and sell predictions about your future behavior, then the question is, okay, what can you do? One answer might be to regulate these businesses. This is a little tricky. Regulation in the tech sector always lags a little bit behind because regulation takes time and technology advances pretty quickly. But you might think, okay, there's a role for regulation here. The example of the right to be forgotten is a regulatory measure. That's a piece of state action, government action that, yeah, not state action, it's the EU, but government action that is sort of going to keep these businesses and their potentially dangerous impulses in check. We might think about stakeholder management. So having stakeholders, people who are affected by a business, brought in on the decision-making of the business. Facebook has done this a little bit in sort of its baby steps so far, but has done this a little bit with its sort of free speech policy. So, you know, Facebook has assembled a group of people, basically, who are going to form a kind of court that helps decide cases, controversial cases about what can or can't go on Facebook. Okay, so stakeholder management might be part of it. If we wanted to get a little bit more radical than that, we might talk about breaking up these companies. So maybe the problem here is the monopoly that these companies might have. So Google has more or less a monopoly on search. There are other search engines, but they make up a very small portion of, outside of China, a very small portion of, you know, the web traffic. So okay, maybe breaking up the different functions that Google provides. Breaking up Gmail from Google Search, from YouTube, and so on, so that these different parts of the business can't sort of trade information back and forth. Okay. And lastly, we might talk about, even more radically, we might talk about socializing these businesses. That is taking ownership of them, literally changing who owns the business. So maybe the businesses should be owned by users. Maybe the businesses should be owned, like public utilities, in part or in whole by the governments that might regulate them. Okay, so obviously there are concerns about that too. Maybe you think that, well, maybe the profit motive doesn't work for the U.S. government the same way that other things do, but the sort of temptation to surveil is still going to be there. Okay. So these are a few possible sorts of solutions, each of which has its strengths and weaknesses, but I think it's worth thinking about them going forward, as these businesses take up larger and larger roles in our lives. Okay, let's call it there. Good work.